Hello, my name is Veronica Chanfrano. I am the curator for Melton Gallery at the University of Central Oklahoma. This video is the first in a series of conversations with philosophers. POPC, or the Philosophers Ontological Party Club, provides one-to-one conversations between the participants and professional philosophers in public settings. By pairing a philosopher with a participant, POPC provides a setting where the philosopher can gently guide the conversation and provide genuine listening. These conversations can change how the participant thinks and gives ordinary everyday people a chance to develop their own thoughts on a particular topic. This builds responsible citizenship through self-awareness. The topic that we're going to be talking about is called art as cognition. Conversations typically begin with questions like, what do you get out of art? Do you think art gives you any knowledge of the world? What's the process of experiencing a work of art? Does art change your perception about things? Our first philosopher that I'm going to be speaking with today, his name is Bill. He has a book currently out called Attentional Engines, A Perceptual Theory of the Arts. He is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine. He is an adjunct lecturer in philosophy at the University of New Hampshire, and he's a visiting scholar in psychology at Boston College. I've been fortunate enough to have many conversations with many philosophers as a result and talk about art. And it really has made me think more concretely about things. Even though I'm in the art world, I make art, I show art, I research art, I still needed to kind of run through my thoughts with another person and have them reflect back onto me to really know what my thinking is on something, to really solidify my thoughts on something. So anyway, I found it to be kind of transformative, and so hopefully we get some other people who are interested in participating in this project, so that they can know, what that feels like too.
Yeah, very cool.
So, what aspect of art as cognition are you sort of interested in specifically? Like, what did you want to talk about regarding art as cognition?
I think that's kind of it's a hard question for me to pinpoint. I don't think there's any aspect of art that isn't associated with cognition. I think that artworks are a vehicle that we use to express ourselves. They're an extension of the way we share ideas with people in the world. When you ask that, I guess that the thing that's most interesting to me in thinking about art and cognition is how artworks work to share ideas. Because it's kind of a funny thing to be shown an artifact and to think that this is a way of sharing ideas. And certainly in the discussion of art over the years, there's been a lot of conversation about how we interact and react to artworks is subjective, and that the content of the work is in the eyes of the beholder, so to speak, or in the eyes of the consumer, depending upon, I suppose, when you came to learn about art and what the rest of the world was like in those days. And so I want to think about a way that artworks could be communicative devices, could be a way of expressing ideas that respected the idea that the viewer has this subjective role to play, but still allowed it to really be the case that the artist was expressing themselves. And that, I think, is kind of a funny tension, because if I'm expressing myself in a certain way, you don't get to say what I meant.
Right.
And that's
you kind of do get to say what you meant. Like, there's this idea that once art is released into the world, it doesn't belong to the artist anymore. They've lost power over the meaning of that thing. and it's the consensus of whoever, whether it's the masses, which it rarely is, it's usually an elite group of people that decide what it's about.
Well, and then that's the that's the idea I want to push back against. An example of outsider art that we use in philosophy of art classes to talk about this example. And there's a case from there's a case from Alice in Wonderland that we also think about. There's a guy named Alfred Wallace who made some very beautiful, very sort of simplistic in a way, but really sort of emotionally nice paintings. He made them on pieces of, if I recall, on pieces of plasterboard and wood that he had around the house. And he had been a sailor in the Merchant Marine, and they were pictures of sailing, really sort of simplistic, very beautiful outsider art pictures of sailing. And he, if I remember the story correctly, he suffered from dementia, and it's not clear he really knew what was going on. Yeah, he lived alone in his house, and he was capable of taking care of himself. But it's not entirely sure that he sort of really had a glimpse of what he was making when he made these artworks. They were just these sorts of talismans, these totems in his life that he did that gave him a sort of contact with whatever memories he had of his past. And the story is that these art dealers came from London to his seaside town for a weekend once and saw these paintings, but they thought they were brilliant artworks. And they took them back, right? They bought them from him and took them back and sold them. And these paintings came to take on this broad cultural meaning, but the cultural meaning they came to take on was nothing like what Alfred Wallace had intended when he made those artworks. So the communicative exchange in that case is not between the artist Alfred Wallace and a public. The communicative exchange there is between the gallery owners who have repurposed this artifact for their own purposes. So the exchange there is not the artist's expression. Right. It's not even clear when we think about this that what they saw in the artwork was related to the artist's expression. Right. Right. And we use this case because he had dementia. There's actually a whole lot of sociopolitical stuff about stealing his expressive act and using it for your own purpose. So this is my pushback side, but language is this well-structured adaptation that we've developed that enables us to sort of express ideas in a way that you don't quite get to choose what I meant. The words really have meaning, and you can say, oh, there's some implications here I don't think you've thought about. But what I've said is pretty clear in language. And artworks certainly aren't structured like that. Artworks aren't structured in a way that we have the same kind of control over what they mean as we do over words. But the idea, the thought, is that when we use artworks to express ourselves, we make an artifact that people can recognize as belonging to a certain category, a certain stylistic category. And when we recognize it as belonging to that certain stylistic category, we recognize it as having been constructed with a certain set of art theoretical, expressive, socio-political intentions. And so we recognize that what it was for someone to have made the choices they made in putting that artwork together, their choice of rendering the content in that particular way, were made under the rubric of this expressive category. And so if I make a minimalist artwork and I put it out in the world and you come and you say, what a beautiful construction, you've missed the point. And so the idea here is that there's a complex kind of dance that we engage in when we make art. And that is, we make art under the assumption that the consumer is going to have some common shared understanding of the stylistic categories that we're playing off of. And now we get back over to the other side, to the subjective contribution, and we can talk about the elite people who try to control our conversation in a minute, because they can be silly people sometimes, I think. But these stylistic categories aren't constructed by the artist and imposed on the community that they're speaking to. These stylistic categories are developed in negotiation with the people who engage with the artwork. Right. And so, right, as I express myself in some way and people see it in a certain way. Now, the next time I go about doing it, I'm going to have to modulate what I've done in order to make sure that those folks understand what I meant. But the one last thing to say is that you're absolutely right. what mediates this conversation, particularly in the kind of media dense world that we live in, is a set of gatekeepers. And so there certainly are some social political issues that come into play, and understanding the market.
Yeah. And that's something that I'm really interested in, because I'm interested in the intersection between class and art. And it's not a new idea, but even though it's not a new idea, it still hasn't changed very much over time. The balance of power is pretty much exactly the same. It's a very frustrating thing, because artists need to make money to live. But the system is structured in such a way where you either are getting that money through grants, essentially, galleries, which that's kind of up in the air. They could be funded by some nefarious thing, or they could be funded completely, morally, relatively morally okay. And then collectors, which again, that could go either way. But have you seen The Cost of Everything? It's a documentary. No. The Cost of Everything is a documentary about money in the art world, basically. It came out a few years ago, and they actually interview collectors, and they talk a little bit about how collectors purposefully influence the art market and to drive up the value of the work that they're collecting, so that they can then sell it, or it can stay in their collection and appreciate in value. And it's this sort of cyclical thing. So it's become a commodity, and we can't escape that we live in a capitalist society, and that everything is framed in that way of thinking now, in this country in particular.
So in cognitive science, we include anthropologists as well as psychologists and neuroscientists and people on the technological end of things. And the negotiation through which these stylistic categories emerge, right, involve people who are curators, and people who are collectors, and people who are museum directors. And I think that you probably have hit the nail on the head by saying that the intentions of these characters play a significant role in constraining the way these stylistic categories develop over time. And they can leave critical bits and pieces out of the world, and it's a big world, and who makes it through the haze to have their artworks heard and be participants in this conversation is affected by these kinds of gatekeepers. And certainly when people think about the way I think about art and cognition, they often say that it's well and good to think about how this all works, but you have to take a stand at some point and think about the politics of things as well. It's not okay to just sit back and wonder how it all works at the psychological level. You have to think about what the context and the effects of what you're saying might be. And
have you ever taught an art history course, like an Art 101 or anything like that, in your year of teaching?
I have never taught an art history course. My background starts in continental philosophy as an undergraduate, moved through art school with my MFA, which did have an academic component to it, but I completed it by taking courses in philosophy mostly. And then I worked as an artist assistant in New York for some artists who were pretty successful, and I had an inside view of some of the things you were just talking about. Pretty amazed, and I felt pretty lucky to have access to see that end of the art world, because it's an end of the art world that only a few people get to participate in, and I got to be a fly on the wall for a little bit, and it was pretty cool. I think the people that I was working for were the political good guys.
Oh, the reason I asked if you've ever taught an art history class, which to bring my question, is because A lot of times when you're starting out in academia, at least for me anyway, when I was starting out as an adjunct,
Mhm.
I got Art 101 classes. That was my main source of income, was teaching introductory art classes.
Sure.
And I found that the easiest route to take was to talk about the monetary value of works of art and then go backwards from there. So that was the way to kind of get people engaged in the idea of value and then how we construct it, and then sort of unveil it from there. So anyway, that's why I was asking if you've ever taught art history, because it's very clear when you do teach that introductory class how we construct value as a society is very much based on how much someone is willing to pay to own that thing.
So when I teach philosophy of art, I do a lot of art history, but contemporary art history, right? So I don't run them through the history of art. I do try to point out to them something that, our fascination with the aesthetic is probably related to the role it played in religious paintings in the Middle Ages. And that I try to do that to disabuse them of the idea that art is necessarily aesthetic. But what I do is I try to take artworks that if they saw in the museum, and usually in class, they would say, what on earth did I pay an admission fee to come in and see this? And I try to give them the background, try to give them the backstory around the category of art that artwork belongs to, so that they don't have to appreciate it in the end. They don't have to, in the end, see it as intellectually valuable to them to have come to understand it. But they can see that it has some depth, that the content of the work has some depth. And I'll be really honest that it probably seems a little silly that I had to be as old as I was when it really sort of occurred to me. But when I started working as an artist assistant, I had this funny strategy at first. I worked for artists whose art I didn't already love, because I wanted to make sure it was a job, that I was there just doing the work that these artists wanted me to do, and I wanted to go home and make my own art. And what I discovered was that it didn't take very long, once you understood the backstory, the background around the content of the work, that you came to appreciate it a lot.
Yeah.
Right? That once you understood why the choices were being made to make the artwork that way, even the little practical decisions about how to make it so it wasn't too heavy, or it could be movable, or it could be taken apart and put together by people who had no idea. Once you understood the sort of stylistic category that constrained the sorts of choices someone was making, and you understood why they were making those choices, and so you could appreciate, not, oh, am I struck by awe when I stand in front of it, but you could appreciate in the sense of you could understand how it worked, how it went together, and how it worked to express the ideas that were thought. It came to be really hard to find an artist to work for who I was neutral about. I came to kind of love them all. I kind of came to like everything that I ended up helping construct and release into the world. And so that's the kind of, so it's not an art history club.
Did you have your pick of artists to work for?
What's that?
Did you have your pick of artists to work for as a
Well,
student?
one advantage to being in New York City and being an art student in New York City is that your program has a visiting artist program. Artists are coming through and giving studio visits and talking all the time. And when they do that, they often need help on projects. And so, no, I did not have my choice who to work for. But when I signed on to the kinds of projects that I hoped would have the potential to lead into something, right, as we all do when we kind of sign on to projects, and we engage in vocations that turn out to be avocations that occasionally pan out. I did sort of work for a bunch of different folks in that context.
So I remember I was a studio assistant for many years for one person who ended up being a mentor to me. She was a public artist. But it was $10 an hour, I remember, and that was might as well have been $1 million to me in college. And I called her every day to get that job for a month. I would leave a voicemail on her answering machine every day for a month. And the only reason I got that job was because the guy who got the job before me just was like kept being late or something. And the day she fired him, she finally called me back. But that was a 1 in a million job. I was like, I get to get paid.
Yeah, it's cool, right?
Art all day. This is crazy.
It was a fun thing to do for many years.
Yeah.
That's funny. When I was in college, I scheduled my classes so that I could take a tape to CBGB's every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. I probably gave that guy 5,000 tapes before he listened to one of them.
Yeah.
Those were the days, right? So when I taught that class, when I teach those classes on philosophy of art, and we go through sort of the process of helping people understand how to look at an artwork as a communicative, expressive act and not as an aesthetic object, I often do this soloist drawing project where I have the class come up with some very simple geometric drawing instructions. And then we set 8 by 24-foot sheets of paper up on the wall. We use a random number generator to mix them up, and we divide up into groups, and people go out and kind of make the artwork and then step back and look. And they're often pretty amazed and shocked at how intentional they have to be at making these random marks to end up with something that looks like what they had hoped they were going to make. Right. So the expressive act, even in this random process, is really intentional. And it's intentional. It's funny in these sorts of projects that the groups will be really frustrated that other people don't get to what they thought they saw they were making. Right. And it's actually it's enlightening to me to watch them do it, but I think it's enlightening to them to see that making art is hard. Because making art is doing this very sort of abstract thing on your own, independent of where people are going to see it, right? And you make it and then you release it, and right? And if it doesn't have the effect you intended, it can be a little frustrating, right? And
the idea of control too comes into play. Like once it leaves your space, you relinquish a lot of control, unless you are already very successful and you can exert your power over whatever gallery or museum you're showing. But it becomes a collaborative endeavor at the very least once it leaves your space.
And it's a collaborative, communicative endeavor, and that was kind of so. For about 10 years, when I worked at Bates College, I did these projects, and the goal of the project was to try to learn how to use people as a medium of expression. That sounds like, we talk about power and I say it that way, it sounds a little weird, but right. But really the goal was to try to figure out what you would have, how would you have to structure the instructions, right, in a way that you could release these instructions onto a group of total strangers, and they could realize it in a way that bore some resemblance of what you had intended to express. But I really was more interested in these note card exhibitions that Lucy Lepard used to take all over the country, right? Because they had to be constructed, when you wrote them up, they had to be made of the kind of thing someone could get at a hardware store, so it wouldn't be hard for people to get the materials, right? Yeah. And then you had to think of how those instructions could be read by somebody and put together. So in sort of thinking about this idea of it being a communicative event, that was my field experiment over the course of 10 years. What we discovered a lot about, actually, which was kind of funny, which is not related to the angle that we've been taking this conversation, is that there are these significant distinctions in how people's bodies affect the way they do this.
Makes perfect sense.
Right? People who are really, right? So one thing that I would do, now I'll do something embarrassing and dance in front of you on the screen, is you use your shoulder as the pivot of a compass and just reach up as high as you can. and make a perfect curve. And it takes people a while to make it. And the curve it tapers towards the bottom, which is kind of funny because of the biomechanics of it. But you could just have people do that on a sheet, and it turned out to give you this really awesome record of the size of the people who had come through the room. One thing I discovered, even in a class of people who went to a tiny school where everybody kind of knew each other, was that the social dimension of starting this project was terrifying for them.
Yeah.
Right. So the first drawings they made, the marks had no relationship to each other, and they were all in one part of the paper. Right. Everybody would stand around, they get nervous, they go make one right next to it. And it would take them a couple weeks, usually, of class time, to sort of get comfortable in thinking, because these are 8 by 24-foot sheets of paper, and they have all this space to use chalk lines. It was kind of neat because you got to see the social dimension of communication happening right in front of you. Anyway, so I mean, those are the kinds of ways that I've come in and approached this kind of work. And you know, hearkening back to when I was in college, I could imagine people responding that the desire for control over this communicative process is a sociocultural, it's a culturally bound thing in and of itself, right? It comes from the sort of logical basis of knowledge in the 19th and 20th century West, and it comes from being a person who spent an enormous amount of time in their life learning how to taxonomize and organize facts, so that they could be conveyed in a system that would control the way we thought back on the history of art.
Yeah.
Right? I can kind of imagine a lot of places where the pushback might happen. And people who have come to hear me talk about this project have sometimes raised a hand at the end and said, well, how does this help society? Right? And my answer would be that I think our capacity to communicate with each other is not an abstract logical thing. It's an embodied and kind of real social relationship. And that I think exploring how artworks can work as expressive and communicative acts help us understand more anthropologically, socially, and maybe even personally the nature of our communicative interrelations with one another. And that's really abstract, and I give you no evidence for it, but that is.
So I think the way that kind of relates to what's happening to us right now under quarantine is I think people are realizing how important physical communication actually is to us. It's just it's inherent within us. I have this theory, and it's not founded on really any concrete research or anything like that, but that technology has evolved faster than us. So our dependency on it isn't caught up with our physical evolution as apes, basically. So
Barking primates.
Yeah, we're so in tune with our physical bodies in space that I think it creates a lot of anxiety in us when we divorce our mental selves from our physical selves, which I think we're constantly doing as a result of technical communication that we're hooked on, and we need it because we're communicators, you know, as a species. That's how we've survived, is because of our really excellent communication skills.
Yeah. Well, sometimes one thing that I talk to the kids about in class that's related to this is that actually there's a giant subjective share in just our conversation right now. Because I'm not sending, it's not like the electric company on PBS. I'm not sending words across space to you, right? I'm sending sounds across space to you, right? And we have these very cool things stuck in our noggin that are able to decode those sounds and reconstruct it, right? When I send these sounds at you, you reconstruct those sounds as words in your head, and you sort of ascribe meaning to those sounds by reconstructing them in your head. And part of that has to do with the emotionally expressive capacity of my body when I make gestures when I speak. And so this conversation actually is rather complicated, because all I'm doing is sending the words to you. right? They're not, you get the words, but you're not getting, right, the sort of embodied emotional part of our conversation. Of course, helps that we discovered that we share geographic backgrounds, so that I don't know if it's true, but I would imagine that there are gestural commonalities that are familiar in our conversation from the fact that we sort of probably grew up within 12 miles of each other over the course of. I would guess that we were separated by a year or two, but I would guess that there are some commonalities there that are unnoticeable to us, but maybe there. Anyway, so I mean, if you think of it that way, then our conversation isn't that much different in kind than in artwork, right? Because I'm just sending these compression waves out into the universe, and I'm depending upon you being able to reconstruct them in your head in a way um, that matches to our world. But you know, I like that you called us barking primates. That was pretty good.
Thanks.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You had something more profound to say than what I just said.
I definitely did not. I usually don't have anything profound to say. But what I was going to ask before,
Yep.
and I love this question, what's the last time a work of art has changed your perception about anything?
That's a very hard question. So the last time a work of art changed my perception about anything, I'm gonna be a little. I hope this isn't too pedestrian and mundane for you, and then I'll tell a story that probably is more in tune. Was when I looked at the sheep, the 6-hour sheep video on YouTube yesterday.
A 6-hour sheep video.
I don't know if you've been watching this, but somebody has sheep in a vineyard in Napa, and they just have been filming them and posting it as they wander through. And I think, you know, it's very relaxing, but B, I may have laughed for about 22 minutes after I turned it on. Oh, what's that?
Just looking at sheep?
Well, just realizing that I was looking at sheep just wandering around, just doing their thing. It may have been the most awesome. I really did laugh for a long time. So that one's good. And now you look, that's an artwork of its own sort, right? It's not an artwork of the kind we've been talking about. But it's right. It's an artifact, a physically constructed artifact that's been released on the world to express something about the way people are feeling now. The artwork that I would go with you that's more in line with what we've been talking about is a Nancy Holt piece called Missoula Ranch. So I think it's called Missoula Ranch Locators. So Nancy Holt, for people who might be listening and don't know, made these little pipes. She would suspend pipes around a room, and as you look through them, you could see bits and pieces of the environment that she had wanted to bracket for you. There are a couple things I really like about Nancy Holt. She was a land artist in the 1960s. There were a lot of land artists that were out using bulldozers to destroy the land in order to make their work, whereas what she was doing was placing objects to let you look at the land, to orient yourself to the land. So instead of bending the land to her desires, she was revealing the land to us. And this is partly because she was a film artist. She wasn't a video artist because there was no video. She was a film artist who made some awesome 16mm movies. What I love about Missoula Ranch Locators is that it's a ring of metal pipes oriented towards the environment around this ranch in Montana. So there are mountains in the distance. And our natural, I think our natural reaction to this artwork, because we understand landscape as a medium, and we're used to paintings that show us the landscape in all of its grandeur, is to think of this as a way to look out at the landscape around, that these are views of this broad, giant landscape around in the distance. It's a circle. If you are smarter than I am, you would notice without reading that the circle is divided up into the points of a compass. Right, so it's got a nice grid with all these intermediate spots on the compass rose. And what I loved about this work, you can't see this work in person, but you can see documentation of the work, was there's a photograph of people standing in it and using it, right, when she introduced the installation. And they aren't standing in the middle looking out. They're standing on the outside looking in. Um, and so when you see this, when you see the embodied relationship between the viewers and the work, you get a different view of what the work's about all of a sudden. And it can be a little confusing the first time you see it to wonder why they're standing on the wrong side of the artwork, because you've categorized it as a landscape artwork, as like a landscape painting, and in associating that with that category, right? You thought that obviously your attention should be directed to the mountains in the background. So if it were a landscape painting, that category would tell us how to attend to the work and how to see its parts. And then we see these people and they're in the wrong place. And so, then I did a little more reading about it. And what's really sort of cool about it is that the size, the scale of the compass made by, it is oriented on the compass, but the scale of the compass was decided by the distance you had to put the locators so that you could see a full human body on the other side. Right? So it's scaled to the average size of the human body. I would imagine that some people were too small and some people were too short. Right? But that on average, that people sort of fit in this scale. And so when people are on the outside looking in, that's right. It's about the human's existence on the landscape or in the landscape, and not about the landscape that's out around us. Right. So it has this embodied piece to it. It has a sort of minimalist piece to it, right? Because the scale and the composition of the work are determined by the nature of the medium. Right. And not by the expressive desires, the psychological aesthetic desires of the artist. Right? The logic of the work is determined by the medium, but the humans are part of the medium.
Right.
So the humans' engagement through the artwork are the thing that's critical to scaling the size of the medium.
Yeah.
Right? So now we get this embodied work that's about communication, it's about social engagement. It's also a little bit about our alienation from the environment.
Yeah.
And our alienation from the attributes of the environment that mark landscape painting, both beauty and sublimity, both the idea of being awed by the grandeur of the landscape, but also being scared by the scale of the landscape, right? Because our backs are turned on the landscape we're embedded in.
Yeah.
And I thought that was pretty intense. And I thought that the kind of land art category that Nancy Holt's working in is a hard one to have an intuitive grasp of.
Yeah.
You really need an intellectual grasp to understand the communicative act of that work. Now we
get to it too.
Yeah. Well, now it's actually kind of hard because, as you know from having worked in art history, a lot of the texts that reveal these works to people are not designed to be comprehensive historical texts. They're designed to be critical texts with a little bit of history involved.
Yeah.
And so you can be captured by the criticism of the time and miss the facts about the work. And, but Nancy Holt's pretty well documented. But anyway, so you could embed that in a political context in which it might mean one thing as opposed to another, right? You could imagine it being about, right, ignoring climate, or a lot of things you could say. I don't think you could say them of Nancy Holt particularly.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of ways you could see. There are a lot of ways you could embed the way she's oriented the consumer to the environment in this piece, right? That play into, right, certainly her politics about understanding the land, but we could also make comments about the politics of her generation in the land. And right, there are ways in which its content extends beyond this narrow content, right, expressive content that I've described.
Right.
That tie into a lot of things you were saying earlier on in our conversation. But I think understanding it, the intellectual act of understanding it, was actually kind of nice. I hope that tied a couple things together. That's what I wanted that example to do. But it's genuinely the last artwork that blew my mind, I think.
Yeah. I think it's hard. The reason I say that is I think every artist dreams that they will do that they will change someone's mind or significantly impact the way that they think about something. Maybe every person wants that. I don't know. But in our innate ability to communicate, there is this idea that you will communicate something that will blow someone's mind or change them. in some way. And artists are no exception to that. And I think that land art is kind of interesting in that for most people, that only exists in a few pictures in a book. Well, I have a friend that just drove across country. Bad time to do that, but she didn't know.
Right.
And she tried to go to the lightning field, and they make it almost impossible to go there. And the lightning rods don't actually work, she said, that because we refer to the same, we remember the picture of it in our textbooks of lightning hitting the lightning rods in the field. And it was the only picture
Ever.
that we knew from it. So that was the work of art in our brains. And so she had that in her mind when she went there. And then she realized the work of art was not that it was catching the lightning. It was the way that all the rods were perfectly measured to fit the landscape so that they were all on the same exact plane.
So when you look out, they all have the same height.
A perfectly straight line across the horizon.
Gotcha.
And she said, that's the work. But being there, getting there, and trying to be there was so hard that when she finally experienced it, she was like, damn, this is just a picture in a book for 99% of, I mean, if it's this hard to come see it, then this is not this. It's the picture from our textbook.
Well, it is a piece of conceptual art.
Yeah.
And so the sort of physical manifestation of it, and it seems to me in that case, the physical manifestation probably is pretty intense and probably pretty important.
Yes.
But I would imagine that as a piece of conceptual art, given that the idea is the art, right there might be an argument that you should keep people from seeing it. Yeah.
Ooh.
But in a way, right? You know, I mean, Saul LeWitt, I think, was always a little bit bothered that what people really cared about was what they saw on the wall.
Yeah, people are very product driven, I think.
I mean, I think he loved seeing it on the wall, right? But I love the idea that he scribbled those things out and faxed them to the gallery and then just showed up there. It's not really true anymore, I know, but I mean, that was the idea.
You really cracked the code.
Yeah. Although the assistants that put those on now get paid a lot by hour.
Good. For me, I think, so I went to the mattress factory. Have you ever been there?
No.
It's in Pittsburgh, and it's 100% installation art. And it's a really great museum. So I went there a couple of times, and I always appreciated James Turrell's work, but had never really experienced it. And they had, I forget the name of the piece, but it was a gray square that just slowly emerged. You were led into this dark room, and it was two people at a time. You had to hold onto a rope to get into the dark room, and you sat there, and it took about 5 minutes for the gray square to slowly emerge onto the wall in front of you. But he had also built a stage around where the projection was, so you could hear the echo when you were in this dark room, that there was some kind of presence to the thing in front of you. And I'm a pretty impatient person, but I think experiencing that and waiting for that to emerge truly changed the way that my brain works. I really think that it was an actually transformative experience because it was rewarding being in the moment and being patient and valuing these small nuanced experiences while you're waiting and sort of savoring the silence. And I truly did walk away with that, from that experience, with a new thinking about those things. Like it really changed my perception.
You meant it to, but it kind of reflects the value of an aesthetic experience too, right? I mean, not in the sort of 19th century political art way, but just in the reflective moment of letting the world reveal itself to you while
Yeah.
you sort of bracket yourself away from the anxieties that drive day-to-day life.
Yeah. And
I mean,
it's hard to divorce yourself from um, this like sort of compartmentalized existence where everything is organized by minutes and hours and tasks to accomplish. And I guess that changes depending on people's socioeconomic backgrounds, but for most of us, our value is how much we can contribute, whether it's financially or whatever.
anyway, I don't think artists are liars though, most of the time. Oh yeah, now we're gonna get somewhere good. Now we're gonna get some good stories. All right.
Some art is, I guess, like minimalism is a good example. That's sort of presented as this is the truth.
Oh yeah, no, there's that philosophical end, the sort of reductive interpretation, which certainly belongs to some of the minimalist artists. But it seems to me it always seems to me that the true heart of minimalism was in this idea that the artwork is like Robert Morris's idea that the artwork is really directing the show. Right, because one idea is that minimalism is about getting to the bare bones of reality.
Yeah.
And that's a very modernist view. But another way of thinking of it, you can't really evoke Carl Andre in these contexts because, we're trying to find something that's neutral. But, his artwork really was about letting the material determine the format. Right, his personal life may have been a little different. Right, but there's a difference between the minimalism, the monumental minimalism we're familiar with, right, and Steve Paxton dancing, making a sandwich.
True.
Again, it's Chuck because you say the name and it's different than the product, right?
Yeah.
Right, like the artwork of making a sandwich may have really been a minimalist artwork, but when we contextualize it in terms of the personality that was behind it, it's a pretty strong personality that seems not to have been about losing control of the artwork.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Does that make sense?
yeah, a lot of minimalism is about control to me, and also very dominated by white men. And so there is a structure within that's, you can't divorce, no matter how hard you try, your personal identity with the thing that you are making, because it's based on your own value structure. Like,
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody that ran this sort of DIY gallery space in Philadelphia, and he was saying that, he had this moment of revelation after it was a group run gallery, and they had their first female member of the gallery, and they were going through works of art to curate a show together. And she hadn't said much during the review process. And they went over their final selections, and she said, you've only picked artwork from white men.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, well, no, this is just good art. And she was like, yeah, you think it's good art because you're a white man, and it's based on your values. It's based on the kind of things that you would like to see, and what the kinds of things that you would like to make. And there's more. I think that's kind of reductive, to be fair, but I also think it's kind of true that it takes a lot of work to divorce your inherent value structure with, what you choose to see or what you choose to show other people.
Yeah.
It's really hard to do, and I think it takes a lot of self-inventory to first recognize where those are in your brain and to move it over here.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree. I'm going to be devil's advocate for a second, but not because I don't think everything that you said just then was exactly right. The first thing I would say was that when I think of minimalism, I think of the spirit of the early Judson Church dance works. When I think of the kind of minimalism we think of when we think of the world, I think we think of monumental sculptures.
Yeah.
And I don't think people appreciate them because they're minimalist artworks. I think they appreciate them because of the natural aesthetics of the materials and natural aesthetics of the scale of these kinds of large scale works. And so, not to have Saul LeWitt pop up all the time, but I do think of the difference between his writing about making his drawings and the way his drawings are made. Right. So in his writing about making the drawings, he says, look, the draftsman, the art is just the idea. The draftsman is the person who realizes the art, and the artist has no place. And that the draftsman is going to make mistakes and do things that have to do with their taste. And so the art is the idea, and its sort of implementation is going to be different from place to place, not just because the architecture is different, but because the different drafts people are going to make different kinds of mistakes. And of course, that artwork became very valuable very quickly. And I'm not a contemporary art historian, and someone else can step in and fill in this story in more detail. But the assistants get paid $500 an hour to realize those artworks now, and they have to be realized precisely correctly. And that's not what the spirit of the work was. I can't imagine Saul LeWitt being at all disappointed that he was making a lot of money. I can't imagine that. I can imagine being disappointed that people weren't getting the spirit of the idea behind the artwork. But of course, it wouldn't affect the artwork that it was being implemented, realized, and distributed this way if you understood the artwork the way he intended it. Right?
Yeah.
Because the artwork is the idea, and the implementation has been taken over by other people who created this financial juggernaut over it. I mean, to the extent that sometimes when I implemented these projects with my students, people in charge of the space would be concerned that we were violating copyright, and I'd have to assure them that we were making our own instructions.
Right.
And that we weren't borrowing anything that could be traced back to the way. But I think from the standpoint of minimalism, right, the work is just determined by the way the medium moves the marks, right? The artist is supposed to move stuff. So I don't want to contradict or deny or not agree with anything that you were saying about the personalities, right, and the sort of machismo of material, right, that got sort of that is associated historically with minimalism as a time, because the mentalist sculptures, and because Donald Judd was probably a control freak.
Just a little sketch, a little bit.
But I just wanted to clarify that when I'm thinking about minimalism, I'm really thinking of this anti-aesthetic movement that's better exemplified by the Judson Dance Theater Workshop's early work before it became a codified kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I've done with the students in those classes is we've done Judson style dance exercises with the dance instructors on campus. which is often quite fun because they're often quite surprised about why they're being asked to walk in a box.
I
Or
want
why,
to take a class. That
well,
sounds fun.
I want everybody to take my class. The best is when you do it on the grass and afterwards there's an artifact of the dance that looks like a drawing, but only if you're on the top floor of the library.
Right on.
The one thing that we didn't get to talk about that I think actually is a kind of important thing to talk about is the relationship between science and art, the explanatory relation between science and art, not the expressive or aesthetic. But there's a tension often between the idea that you could explain the way people interact with artwork psychologically and the idea that that might contribute to an understanding of art. Because often I think people think that appealing to psychology and neuroscience is a reductive approach to understanding art, and then it reduces art to nothing but those sorts of things. Or at least that seems to be an objection that people raise. Whereas the real question is whether those sorts of ways of thinking of things can enhance our understanding of art, not whether they can replace them.
Yeah, it seems to make sense to me that it would help you understand why you think what you think about something, or help you understand the role you're supposed to play in the experience.
That means you're an artist. Artists like to hear that.
Yeah, that's true.
They want to hear how it works because you want to know, you're probably an accidental modernist. You want to see how the mechanisms support the object.
True story.
I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a how you make art way. So when we think of cognition, we think of the science of cognition, and I'd like to turn my attention to thinking about how the science of cognition might help us understand art as well.
So then we can end it there, and anyone that's interested in continuing this conversation with Bill, sign up on the sign-up sheet that is hopefully in a link right next to this video online. And you also can reach out to me if you have any questions on artist cognition or about life or about art in general. Yeah, we'll sign off.